And we had some really good discussion in the last session, getting us on that sort of platform. And Yuen's going to lead us through this session. You do have an assignment at the end of this, which is based on the learning management system, but you'll be starting to look at some crash diagrams, some crash reports, some crash areas, and starting to put into place some of the stuff Yuen's going to take you through today. The next session next week, Tanner is going to take you quite in depth into some vehicle related stuff to look into vehicles and interact that into the road environment, the speeds and the like. And then as I remind you that fourth session has been pulled back one day due to public holiday. So just hopefully you've got the calendar invite and the emails to change that, but I remind you of that. So I remind you that as Yuen is presenting, I'm in the background monitoring the chat. So I look forward to you putting your questions in as we go. Don't wait for us to stop for questions, and we'll be right. Now, questions immediately come in here about the sort of logistics side of things. Do we need to have those cardboard VR headsets made up by any particular session? Now, I will show you this at the end. They are just a bit of a nice add-on if you get them together and the like. And some people don't use it. You can do everything you need from your desktop computer. They're just a little added extra, and I'll show you through that at the end. But thank you for the question. Okay, so I will be jumping in as Yuen presents to ask some questions as we go. We do have a stretch break within this session, so you can we'll have a little break in there. We've got a couple of polls, we've got some questions, but over to you, Yuen. Yep, we can see your slides now. Module 2.1.
And you can hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, good. Okay, thank you for that. Yes, a bit of a longer session today. So we're going to have some breaks, but we're going to get into a bit more of the crux of it in terms of crash investigation. This session then is called Crash Investigation and Analysis Basis, and there's going to be two modules. And the first one is talking a bit about what are we actually trying to produce here? What are the end product, and what do we want to get out of our crash investigation? And what are some of the key questions of a safe system crash investigations that we want to look into? As I said, it's going to be two sessions, but we're going to start with the first one there, which is 2.1, and that's quite a bit longer than the second one. The second one will be more looking at the site visit, and I know that's something that Tana's going to cover a bit as well. But we're going to start and look at some basics when it comes to what do I actually do on the crash site, what do I look for, and how can I step through that process to get the most out of it. Going right into it, in terms of the end product, there's a few things there, and I'll remind you again then that again, this goes back to what is actually the purpose of our investigation. We do not need to do the same thing on a crash site. We do not need to cover the same things as a forensic crash investigation from the police or a research investigation. What we want to look for again is to understand what are the deadly crash forces in this site, in this crash, and what has happened that has led up to that. So again, what do we actually want to get out of it? Well, we want to have a narrative describing the crash scenario involving vehicles, road users, road environment, key contributing factors for the injury outcome. It's normally difficult to just make statistics or to just look at a crash investigation from an Excel spreadsheet and read a line and understand everything. Even though it's perfectly fine and a lot of people do it, pretty much everyone does it that does crash investigations, that you pull out aggregated data from the investigation, make statistics and aggregated analysis from it. But in the actual case, of course, you want some kind of narrative to paint a picture of what's actually happened. Some kind of illustrative description of the crash site. The vehicle is possible. Sometimes we get access to the vehicle, sometimes not. It depends quite a lot on the agreements that each jurisdiction and each authority have between other stakeholders, maybe the towing companies or the police, or depending if the vehicle is impounded, etc., or under investigation. But in many cases, it's possible to get to the vehicle. So photos, videos, crash diagrams, etc., everything that helps us to navigate on the crash site, to understand sort of the trajectories of the vehicle, etc., that we know it's quite difficult to remember. We are at the crash site, we understand things, but then when we get out of there, and we either are going to remember it ourselves or we talk to other people about it, it's quite useful to have those illustrative descriptions. We want to have some in-depth descriptions on what caused the injury outcome. And we also want to conclude if there's any new knowledge from the investigation, which sort of goes without saying, that sometimes we need to sort of specify that's one of the absolute most important things, where we can go to 10 different crash sites and there's no new information, but we still need to look for it because sometimes it pops up and it's really valuable. And of course, we want to be able to guide decisions making on how to prevent similar events in the future. And what we're going to do today is to start to look a bit more on these things in the end, on some key questions to guide the investigations into the sort of cover those bullets. So in order to not do the crash investigation just ad hoc on your gut feel, but actually have some kind of a protocol and some kind of questions that guides us to do that. So, of course, this is not an exact science, that these are the only questions that we can ask, and these are the absolute best one, but they provide a framework that works pretty well over 20 years that I've done it, and I know a lot of people that have similar things. So in this course, this is sort of what we're gonna focus on a bit. And the first one is looking at the actual crash scene, and guide, or have questions that guides us to understand those injury mechanisms. So the first one would be, what are the injuries sustained and the cause of death? The other thing would be, what are the essential injury mechanisms? And the third one then, which is maybe the most important, what deficiencies in the road transport system allowed for these injury mechanisms? So when we talk about injuries sustained and cause of death, that could be, of course, on a high level of detail or a lower level of detail, but it's still good to have an idea about it. So if you have a coroner's report, if you have a word from the police or a preliminary coroner's report, or I know that looks quite different in different jurisdictions on how you get that information. But through the police narrative or in different ways, there's normally a way to understand how did this person die. And we're gonna have a look at a few different injury mechanisms and what actually caused people to die on our roads, how morbid that may sound, but that's the purpose of this course as well. And then what are the essential injury mechanisms? And an injury mechanism would be the way that these injuries on our bodies actually appears or happens. What's the actual event? So we're going to look at that as well, and see what that could mean. And then when deficiencies, when we pretty much talking about what are the gaps in the system, what are the inherent risks that allow for these injuries to happen. And again, then we're not necessarily talking about what actually caused the crash to happen, even though that could be, of course, part of the picture, and we need to understand that. But normally we want to understand what allowed for these deadly crash forces. So we're going to look at quite a number of examples today. It's not only going to be text and bullet points. We're mostly going to go through pictures and have a look and show some example just to get a feel for things on how it can look and how it can be. And that's also what's going to end up in the assignment in the end. We want to look at this as well. I just want to mention it today that some of the key questions also relate to investigation outputs, because once we've identified the deficiencies and sort of classified them a bit and understood them, we want to understand, of course, how can these be prevented in the future. We also want to understand, is this totally new information or have we known this for a long time? Do we have guidelines and tools, interventions, programs, procedures, strategies maybe that actually prevent these things? So the reason for why these deficiencies are in the transport system is because we know them, but we haven't had the funding or the prioritization to actually do something about them. Or is it that, no, this is totally new information, this came up now and we need to form a program, we need to do something because it's new information. So that relates to the next bullet point then, which is, well, if we don't have number 5, if we don't have those procedures in place, what do we do in addition to prevent this in the near term and the long term? So those are pretty much the key questions that we want to focus on. But today we're gonna look a bit more up here. So we're not going to talk too much about what do we actually do about it. Today we're going to talk a bit more about how do we understand this and how can we get to the bottom of this. So before we go into a few examples and look at that, I think it's good to just give a bit of a theoretical background, because this is at least a theoretical course as well. So we do want to understand a bit more about accident research. And you might remember the root cause analysis that we talked about in the beginning of the last session, or yeah, the last session, where we did acknowledge that pretty much every accident research or chain of event that is described as a crash has some kind of chain of event. And this is one. It's called the integrated safety chain. It's commonly used in vehicle industry to understand and to describe crashes. And it's pretty much that root cause analysis type of chain in the bottom of the picture on that previous session, but it's sort of translated into a road crash and in many cases a vehicle crash context. So we start our journey in normal driving, but then something happens. Maybe we are distracted, we pick up a mobile phone, or we start to feel fatigue, something that deviates from normal driving. So I'm not 100% in the loop anymore as a driver. And then there is an emergent situation. Maybe there's something happening in an intersection that I don't observe. I sort of drift close to the center line, or there's something else, and that I don't correct anything, so which means that it goes into a critical situation. Maybe I actually leave my lane, and then into a crash avoidable phase where it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when I crash into that head-on or that oncoming vehicle. And there's a crash, and after that, emergency service and healthcare, hopefully. What we would normally say is that, well, there's a lot of things across this chain that's valuable that could bring me back to normal driving maybe. So in those first critical phases, the crash is still avoidable, and we can warn, we can support, we can sort of correct by even by vehicle support systems or road support systems, etc. But then maybe if the crash avoidable is unavoidable, I can still brake before the crash, maybe AEB, I can do other things, pre-tensioners, etc. We do a lot with crash protection in crash worthiness in the crash, and we can do other things as well. And what we want to focus on is, of course, crash. Again, we're looking at crash forces, we're looking at it, trying to create a forgivable environment, and that's what we want to do. But I guess the reason why I show this picture is that we shouldn't still forget about the other parts of the chain of event, where we can say, okay, we focus on the crash forces, but there were some obvious things leading up to this crash, which I want to note, which I want to sort of understand a bit more about, even though it's not the absolute focus on the investigation. So again, when we look at the key questions, those are more related to the crash. What are the injuries sustained? What are the injury mechanisms? But still, of course, when it comes to deficiencies, there might be other things leading up to the crash as well. Okay, before we go into a few examples then, Ken?
Yeah, it was just a question that sort of led on a bit from the last module. So we were talking about the different crash investigations, one being the sort of road authority investigation. And the question is, in Sweden, do they still do these, though, the road authority style investigations and the safe system style thinking investigations, or have they combined that into the one?
No, it's combined into the one. Yeah, so there's only one investigation, and that covers everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So how do we get injured in road crashes? If we ought to, and why is that important? Well, I think the key bits of that is not just because it's interesting and because we want to learn more. We want to learn more because at the end of the day, we want to understand what could have prevented this crash. And to understand that, we need to understand a bit more on what actually caused those injuries. And that could be in a number of ways. And we want to understand that because if you're wearing a seatbelt, that could, or if you're not wearing a seatbelt, had you worn a seatbelt, that could have prevented some fatalities, but not all of them. And that depends on the injury mechanisms, or if you have an airbag, or if you brake before the collision, or if you put up a guardrail, etc. And all of those preventive technologies and treatments relate to a certain injury mechanisms. And if we think that we're doing something good because we're putting up certain treatments, but it doesn't relate to the injury mechanism that's actually present in many of the crashes, we're not going to get the effects and the injury reduction effect that we want, that we're searching. So we need to understand a bit more about this. So we're going to talk us through a few of these, which we can see on the slides. And I think looking at some of these photos, you would start to understand already now that what some of these are. But we're going to step them through one by one to have a look. And the first one we're going to look at refers to the photo top left, which is acceleration forces. And this is not acceleration forces in a Tesla going forward or my motorcycle. It's actually the negative acceleration. So acceleration would be change of velocity over time. So we all experience change of velocity daily, probably, and it's no problem at all. You have the famous quote in terms of it's not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop. And that's absolutely true, even though I think it's difficult to have a sudden stop without speed. So they tend to correlate pretty well. So if you're speeding a lot, I would warn that all of a sudden, there's a big risk for a sudden stop. But it is true, though, we can travel on the highway and we can brake our car, or we can just release the throttle on our car. We go sort of roll into 10, 20 kilometers per hour. We've experienced a delta V, or a change of velocity of 100 kilometers per hour over 10 seconds, and that's totally fine. But suddenly something happens, we need to slam the brakes, and we brake around 1G with good friction, and you'll have that change of velocity over a few seconds. And that's, as I said, around 1G, not very dangerous, maybe a bit unpleasant. If you would go in a Formula 1 car, that braking would probably be around 4 or 5G. So now we're talking 4 or 5 times the acceleration. Still not super dangerous. Although if you crash into like a generic crash into a wire rope safety barrier, would be somewhere around that 5, 6, between 4 and 7 Gs you would experience. So those sportsmen in the Formula One car, they experience barrier hits pretty much every turn. And those are super athletic sportsmen, and they're sitting in a car where that acceleration doesn't have the same impact because you're stuck in your car. But if you go above that and you experience a head-on crash in 100 km an hour, you would experience that the same change of velocity, 100 kilometers per hour, but in 0.1 second instead of 3 seconds. And that's where we start to experience G's up to between 50 and 100, 120. And that's all of a sudden very dangerous. And that's something that's sometimes a bit difficult to understand. And it took a bit of research before people actually understood that injury mechanism. Now, people would understand, and I think most would agree, that if I walk into a door, that could hurt. If I run into it, it hurts even more. But to actually get the measurement out of that and to understand that, oh, if I travel faster, what happens then compared to if I don't travel faster? We know that if we fall from a higher height compared to a lower, also it hurts more. But when we look at sort of car development, we can see that the first car pretty much in every crash disintegrated, like they just fell apart. And we thought that the solution to that was to build very rigid cars. So we started to build cars look like tanks, and they crashed with each other. The cars didn't break, happy days. And then you look into the vehicle and people are sitting there dead, even though it doesn't look like they're very injured. And you start to realize there's that sudden stop actually creates very high forces on our bodies in terms of internal stops. So the car stops, our body stops, but our organs keep traveling within our bodies. So we have our internal organs hit the rib cage. That's very dangerous. We have our cervical spine, top of our cervical spine, experience a lot of forces due to our head accelerating quicker than our bodies, or in the sudden stop. So when it comes to injury mechanisms and how we get injured, a very common way of getting injured is that we actually experience that sudden stop. We might not have any intrusion or anything coming towards us, but our bodies just simply cannot take that negative acceleration. So it could be our neck is broken, our aorta is broken, internal organs are hurt, our brain accelerates inside our skull, and it's injured, and that's quite common injury mechanisms and crash forces. And also, this is the one that's correlating quite a lot with age. So when we age, our blood vessels become more fragile, more easy to break. Definitely, if our heart goes acceleration, the aorta is very fragile on an elderly person. Quite common way of actually getting injured and die in a car crash is aorta rupture. So those are the kind of things that we see when we have this type of crashes. We have two cars colliding with each other. You don't have any major intrusion into the compartment area, but you still understand that for these cars to have come to a stop, there's quite big acceleration forces working in this environment that actually hurts the people that's inside here. The next one that we would look at is intrusion. And again, we said it the last session, there was a trigger warning about different types of crashes and pictures of crashed cars, and we definitely going to look at that today. So again, just a trigger warning. I will say that there might be some blood on some pictures, but we would never see any humans or any people in the picture. Okay, so injury mechanism in terms of intrusion. That happens when the structure of the car is compromised and there's something coming in the environment. If I'm a car occupant, of course, I can also experience that if I'm a pedestrian or if I'm a rider or any type of vulnerable road users, but maybe we wouldn't talk about intrusion then. But at the end of the day, it's going to be intrusion for that foreign object into my body. And we're talking about injuries that are more like a knife stab. Like something's actually intruding to your body, and normally you would bleed out or maybe get crushed because there's such high forces. So in this case, was a failing barrier, or there was a barrier in a very sort of strange situation where they actually ended up with a side collision on an end terminal that causes this barrier to give away, but give away in the car. And 2 people died sitting in the front seats of this car. And this is not acceleration forces in the sense that it's a sudden stop, because the stop wasn't very, very sudden. It's more that things are coming into the compartment, killing me, because it's actually sort of hitting me. Often bleeding. The third one is more crushing. So in this case, maybe you could sort of guess what has happened here if you look at a few crashes. So in this case, we can see that the car is actually mangled a bit all around the vehicle, but still the passenger compartment has held up pretty well. So it's not like the roof is completely pushed down. It's not like the front of the car is sort of disappearing into the passenger compartment. There's no obvious side impacts. It's just sort of a bit bashed up. And this is a typical scenario of a rollover. So vehicle loses control, rolling over. And if you have your seatbelt, normally the outcome could be pretty good, especially if you have your side curtain airbags that sort of contains you so that you don't sort of have your head outside the window when the car is sort of pushed to the side. So, but in this case, there was no seatbelt used. And what happens if you have a quite high-speed rollover is that you get thrown around into the passenger compartment, and sooner or later, a lot of people, or it's quite common that you fly out of the vehicle either through the rooftop, the sunroof, or the windscreen, back, side, side windows or rear windows. In this case, it was the roof, the sunroof, but not the whole way, just a bit of the way, and then got stuck there and then crushed under the car when it stopped. So that's sort of one thing. You can also see it when people get run over by trucks, and you just get crushed under a massive force, be it that you're rolling over or be it that you're actually stuck under a vehicle or something like that. We also have drowning. I mean, it's a quite uncommon, relatively uncommon, but it still happens. And I had this picture in the first slide in the introduction to crash forces, but maybe then it was difficult to see what it actually is. But in this case, it's Sweden, it's right-hand traffic, and you can see there's a small river running under this road. And what happened was that the car lost control, and we will look at that a bit differently on this case actually, or a bit later on this case. But what happened was that the car lost control. The barrier was not able to stop the car from rolling down into this river, and it ended up on the upside down, stuck in the river, and they were not able to open the passenger doors. So a mom and her 10-year-old daughter drowned in this crash. So they were alive. They would have survived the crash, but they drowned because they were trapped in the vehicle. Yes, Ken?
So a bit of conversation going on in the chat, which is great. Thank you to people for putting in their comments and the like. So one, maybe quick, do you know of any research as to whether a sunroof is a safer or non-safer feature, or is that something, I think it was in one of the pictures?
No. The only reasons that I've come across is that you compare cars with a sunroof where you have a big animal impact, for example, because when you have a sunroof, you do strengthen the structure of the front part of that between the A-pillars, like in the front part of the roof. So actually some cars, at least early cars with sunroofs, were better to resist that moose impact or the kangaroo impact, or like that big animal that we have. But that would be very much on the margin. In terms of other safety related, like being more dangerous because you happen to sort of be ejected through it, I haven't seen any research on that, because if it's not the sunroofs, it's the windscreen. If you roll over fast enough, sooner or later you're going to be ejected, and it might be the sunroof, it might be the rear window or the front window, and it doesn't seem to have a major difference. But I'm just saying, I don't know. I haven't seen anything. Maybe someone else has. Yeah.
Okay, if anybody does know of anything specific, please share that. Oh, Tanner maybe knows of something.
So just popping in very quickly, and this definitely doesn't answer all the question about sunroof, but just adds to what Johan is saying. So my research was in vehicle rollover crashes, and in the hundreds of vehicle rollover crashes that I analysed, sunroof was never implicated as a problem with people's sort of body limbs protruding from it in rollover crashes. So I don't think it's too much of an issue yet, but doesn't mean that it's conclusive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for the input, Tanner. Very good. There's a question, Stephen's popped in a question around back to G-forces that the human body can handle. And do we know specific G-forces that the human body can handle before sustaining serious injury or fatality? And also, I mean, you can build on that to explain a little bit more about G-forces over time and the like.
A good question. I should probably know that. Maybe Tana could answer that specific G-force question. The first thing I would say is that it's very different depending on how you're built. If you're an athlete, if you're not an athlete, you could definitely be injured at 4G. We can see, for example, what do you call that? The iris of the eye could start to sort of be a bit loose after even 4 or 5G. So that's where you sort of start to get some of those injuries. But then there are athletes like that's done an Indy 500 crash in 100 Gs and they still survive. But let's talk about the normal crash. If Tana have that number, otherwise we can also talk about peak G or average G. So the peak G would be one thing. It's more like a hit to your head, for example, and then you have your average G, which you want to sort of, if you have a crash, you want to go up in G and keep that sort of average G quite low or quite consistent over the whole crash with no big peaks, and then sort of drop down. So you will have a nice G curves. So it's about peak, average, and then of course how old you are. But what would you say, Tana, would be like the injury tolerance in G? I have numbers on this and I have graphs on it, but I don't really have it in my head.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to say almost exactly the same as you as well. Roughly, depending on age, gender, and your existing medical conditions, 3 to 4 Gs is probably what's tolerable by most people, not all. But what you also touched on just then as well, it's not necessarily to do with just Gs, it's to do with the force or the deceleration measured in Gs applied over a period of time as well. So as Johan was just saying, we'd prefer to keep it at a low, very, very tolerable level for over a greater period than a sharp peak, because that low level that's spread over time tends to be more survivable, if that makes sense. And also, when we look at, when we're conducting crash testing of vehicles nowadays, we don't actually use Gs, we actually use very specific units. So for example, I think there's a fact sheet on head impact criterion, Ken, that we included with this.
That's
or
correct.
With the next one that's coming up, you'll then see that's actually very, very specific. So we've sort of moved away from Gs, which was a good gross measure, down to very, very specific ways of measuring nowadays, where it's calibrated with human cadavers and dummies and so on and so forth. So it's become quite a complex area. But I think what Jan said earlier, roughly about 3 to 4 Gs is a good estimate. But keep in mind that that's not what's measured nowadays when we do crash testing.
Yeah. And what we'll do is, if we do have some specific resources for you, we'll put them into the resource folder, which I will show you, and we'll be able to, as Johan said, he's got that some good papers on that and the like. Will pop into the research folder. Thank you for the question, and Naomi sort of popped in some of that information as well into the chat, discussing things along the same lines. Back to you, Johan, and back to the injury mechanisms.
Very good. Thank you. Good questions. I think the last one to mention is fire. Again, we know that there's a few crashes out there where you actually survive the actual crash forces of the crash, but something happens with the vehicle or with the other vehicle or the surrounding environment, so that there's a fire and you get trapped into the vehicle, and that would be sort of the reason for the fatal injuries. Not uncommonly, people get unconscious and then die in the fire. So they become unconscious and they can't get out of the vehicle for some reason, or for that specific reason. So it may not be that they would have died even though they become unconscious, but that sort of disables them to get out of the vehicle. So these are the ones that I wanted to mention to you. I think in general, these are sort of gives quite good understanding on how we injure ourselves. And as Tana was into, I mean, if you want to dig down into every one of these, there's probably a lot of research and a lot of complexity in all of these aspects, but this is enough for us to go out there and have an idea about, okay, how did this person die and how would we be able to prevent it? I think we have a bit of a poll, Ken, where we just want to ask you, what do you think would be the most common one in all the fatal crashes in your jurisdiction, or let's say Australia? Would it be intrusion, fire, crushing, acceleration forces, drowning? What's the most common one?
Now, remember, the polls and everything that happens during the sessions, you're not marked on. It is the quizzes and the assignments that are after the session. So just pop in your guess or your thoughts on that. We'll see what comes up there. So just ticking in 40 minutes in, Johan, just for your timing reference. As I said, I'll take people through where to find the assignment and things in the learning management system and that resource folder at the end. But getting lots of good thoughts in there. Let's end the poll, and I'm going to share the results so everybody can see. We have most people saying the acceleration force or deceleration or negative acceleration or the crushing there. Any comments on that, Johan?
Well, that's exactly right. At least everywhere where I've been, there might be jurisdictions where there's quite a lot of drowning going on, but not that I'm aware of. The absolute most common one would be acceleration forces, yes. So that's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Okay, a few more slides before we go into the first break. I think we might need a bit of a break and time for questions again. But let's see. So what are these things affected by? How do we actually get these injuries? Well, it could be a lot of things, and I think, again, we're just going to talk about it in general, and then might have some examples to sort of backing that up. But these injury mechanisms and the way people die is affected by the speed, obviously. So with higher speed comes higher acceleration. And normally when we see the injury risk curves that you might be familiar with, which is really trying to understand the correlation between speed and injury. And we use that sort of to design our system, which we talked about in the last session, that 30, 50, 70, etc. was a tolerance level. Really what is behind that is not speed, it's acceleration. Again, it's G-forces. but we measure it in speed because we know that that is a very strong correlation. So the speed in which we travel will of course affect the acceleration in which we hit something. Vehicle safety, crashworthiness, and aggressivity would definitely affect it. So I can have the same acceleration in one car, and that might be more dangerous than, I have one acceleration in one car and have the same in the other car, and that might be quite different in terms of the acceleration that my body is experiencing, because I have an airbag, I have pre-tensioners, I have load limiters in my restraint system, etc., and have a good crash zone. So depending on the vehicle, the same crash can have different acceleration levels on me as a person, depending on the level of safety. Also aggressivity. So in terms of how, for example, that vehicle is designed, it could have different types of properties to injure or not injure a pedestrian. So more or less aggressive, more or less acceleration forces. Again, if you have a hood that is flexible and leaves a bit of space between the engine block and the hood, that's actually creating less acceleration forces to the head of the pedestrian, and contrary. So very much depending on how the vehicle is designed. Protective gear and equipment, of course, so seat belts, but also, and that's again, if I have my seat belt, acceleration levels would still be the same in the end, but I don't experience the same peak acceleration when I hit the steering wheel if I don't have the seat belt. But if I have the seat belt on me, I'm going to experience a much more consistent and lower peak acceleration during the crash phase. So again, very much depending on that seatbelt. That seatbelt, of course, can protect me from crushing injuries to not get ejected. Protective gear in terms of helmets, of course, we would understand ourselves how that would actually protect us. Infrastructure design, barrier systems, other type of treatments that would make the actual crash less dangerous in terms of acceleration. And then age and gender, which of course is not really part of our treatment catalog if we don't want to restrict access to certain genders or access to certain ages, which would be effective but may be not very tolerable or feasible. We do know that we need to take that into account. We know that if we are to adapt the system to an older population, that vulnerability is very much a reality, especially when it comes to acceleration forces and what we can take when we're getting older in terms of our bone structure and also our veins and arterioles, etc. So those are some of the things. Now that's going to lead us just some slides before we get into some examples again on how do I actually analyze what has affected those crash forces and how do I categorize them. And that's when we want to start to talk about system deficiencies. So what has allowed for these crash forces to become deadly in this crash? And we want to do that, we want to do it in a manner that's a bit formatted. So it doesn't really help us to say that, well, if there wasn't no road there, or if there wasn't no car there, the crash wouldn't have happened. Or, well, that is true, but it's not really an option for us, given that we assume that we want to prevent the crash, but still keep traffic rolling. Of course, there might be some exceptions where we say that you should close this intersection or you shouldn't allow access to drug-affected drivers. But in general, that's not an option for us. Or if we say that, well, if the car was flying, just had wings or a rocket system and just was a helicopter instead, I mean, that's not really helpful either. So it's more to understand what would a safe system look like and what's the gap between that and what I see in my crash, and what in the current system is actually missing from what it can look like from a best practice point of view. I want to understand that gap. I want to understand that missing link, because otherwise it's not going to lead me to any feasible treatment. If I say that this car crash could be prevented by a flying car, and that's my suggestion, it's not really going to happen in the next decade. So you want to arrive to something that's actually feasible in a treatment setting, relating to tools that we actually have. And that's why it's quite useful then to compare the conditions in the crash with best practice. And in this case, it would be pretty much a safe available car, like a 5-star rated car, with the safety features that we have. And safest infrastructure at base as benchmark, which could look, of course, quite different depending on where in the system you are. So a safe road look in a certain way if you're on a rural highway, high-speed road, or in a rural low movement context, or if you're in a high place value situation in an urban area. So it looked quite different, and that's something that we need to sort of practice on to understand, like what if the road environment was safe, what then would have happened. So, and this is going to be the last slide before we stop for a bit of a pause. Would be in terms of system deficiencies. When we use safest available car and safest infrastructure as a benchmark, if these are not fulfilled, if I can see that, well, there's definitely things out there that could make this road better or make this car better, we can actually conclude that there are inherent risks in the system that doesn't need to be there. This crash has allowed for crash forces to be deadly. There are deficiencies out there because it's not designed in the way that it should be designed or can be designed. It could be that it's not living up to current standards, or it could be that it's living up to current standard, but standards are not up to best practice. So it could be sort of several levels here. But when we've been on a few crashes when we work with road safety a bit, something that's in theory could look quite complicated comes pretty naturally. I mean, we quite quick understand, if we are sort of quite experienced road safety professionals, what the problem is in a certain road environment where a fatality has happened. Now, maybe that's not the case, that maybe we have the safest car on the best road and the fatality happens anyway. That's a bit of a more interesting scenario, because we know that happens. And we would then sort of say, well, what if best practice road environment and vehicle safety would not help? You would still die. Well, then we want to ask questions like, okay, well, have protective equipment has been used? Maybe you have the safest car in the safer road environment, but you haven't used your seatbelt. Well, that's a quite common explanation to why we see 5-star cars on 5-star roads still be involved in fatalities. You take the seatbelt and you snap it behind your back to avoid the seatbelt reminder. Definitely a bit of a more rare thing to happen, but it happens. So we want to understand, have protective equipment been used, and also would it have helped? Maybe I didn't wear on my seatbelt, but I smashed into a 60-ton truck and it wouldn't have made a difference. But let's say we also ruled out that. Well, then we probably want to look at speeding and extensive speeding. I have a 5-star car on a 5-star road. I'm using my seatbelt, but I'm still involved in a fatal crash. Well, there has to be something else then that actually put this crash outside the effective envelope of what we can do. And that is quite often speed. So someone has been speeding so fast that it wouldn't help to have a barrier there, or there was a barrier there, but it didn't help anyway, or the seatbelt didn't help. So those are the questions that we want to ask ourselves. And in the last model, we're actually going to look at a systematic classification method that would actually help us systemize this in a good fashion. But at the moment, we just want to mention them and sort of draw your attention to that. This is sort of the way that we would think when we go to a crash site to actually guide us towards more helpful solutions. But let's say that we've analyzed those deficiencies. We understand how someone got injured. We understand how those deficiencies, or which type of deficiencies that actually led to that. we want to dig into those deficiencies a bit more and classify them and understand them a bit more. And that's when we would talk about deficiencies as, are they isolated only to this location, or is it more systemic that we want to treat them on a more systemic fashion? But I think maybe Ken, if you have any questions, or maybe we just take a quick 1 or 2 minute break or 3 minute break to actually see if there's you want to have a drink or something like that. We'll have a bit of a longer break in the end of this session before we go into number 2, but I think you've been listening well for 50 minutes, so we need a bit of a leg stretcher.
Okay, no immediate questions in there, but we will take a 2-minute break. So a quick chance to fill water up. So 2 minutes and then we'll get back into it.
Very good. Yeah, we want to understand what kind of deficiencies are there. And the first one is more an isolated deficiency. So it's definitely something that when we look at it, we understand that this is something that potentially is isolated to this specific location. I mean, we don't know because we don't know what we don't know. So it might be that this happens sort of elsewhere in the system, but it's not a major systemic issue, probably. Again, we might not know that. So if we suspect that it is, we might want to raise it, but normally it would be like a local design error or a construction failure, maintenance neglect, maybe could be vehicles as well, like an airbag failure, etc., which sort of gets us to a local quick fix. That sounds like something that's done in a hurry and not very careful, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, it's maybe it's not about, let's say it's a local design error. Someone hasn't sort of pulled the bolt tight or too tight in a barrier system. Well, maybe, well, potentially that's something that just needs to be fixed in this particular location. Now, if there's a systemic error and this guy has been all over the state and done it, of course, we need to check that. But I think you sort of can understand what I mean when I say that it's something that we can fix in one location. We might need to keep an eye on it, but there's nothing that sort of tells us it's systemic. It could be like this. We were out on a fatal crash where we were sort of looking at a gravel road. There had been a guardrail, something stopping the vehicle from entering the forest on the left-hand side. But over time, more and more gravel has gathered on this location. And at the end of the day, there was no barrier left, and the car sort of went over it. Now, can this happen somewhere else? Yeah, of course it can. But we didn't have any suspicion to believe that this was a very, very common thing to do. So you fix it on the location, you might keep your eyes open after something more, but it's not something that's going to be resulting in a big remediation program. It's something that we could see relating to this specific location. You just fix it and you move on. Another type of location we had in this case, someone actually, let's see if I have, no, I should have had a bit of an arrow there to show the departure angle of that vehicle, but you can understand if you're coming through this curve and you lose control of your vehicle and you're continuing straight ahead in the direction of the tangent on the curve, you'll end up in that opening and down in the river. And of course, then in this case, that barrier should have been extended to cover that hole. It wasn't. So more a neglect or more a design error. Our standards says that it should be done correctly. So it's not like we need to go back and revise the way that we do things. It's more in the operational phase and we actually put stuff in there. Now this was a local sort of thing and it was fixed later, but still it sort of created a discussion amongst the subcontractor that has put this up to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the region. So it could be something that leads to regional discussion, of course, and there's no specific rules about this that what it actually sort of exactly should lead into, but it's more something that you do it on spot and you continue with your day. Now it could be though that there are more systemic. Sorry, as you can see, the animation is not really is repeated here. But anyway, compared to isolated deficiencies would be more systemic deficiencies. When we look at something and we suspect that this happened to result in a fatality on this road, but it's probably just a question of time until this happen again, because we can see a design or a vehicle error or something that actually we would suspect is not just isolated to this location. These photos are from the crash that you saw that we talked about with the mom and the daughter that drowned in the river. And what we could see was that they actually skidded on this guardrail. You can see to the top, sorry, the bottom right-hand picture, the skid marks of the vehicle. And the guardrail was, one, it was too short. Two, it was put down in a way that we don't do it anymore. It should be sort of angled out to stop that from happening. So, and three, we had a maintenance issue where we had snow gathered, sort of collected close to the barrier, because the plow vehicle actually put the snow there. It freezes and it acts as a skateboard ramp. And we had a few fatalities, and we've had a few fatalities where that actually happened. So you had snow getting plowed towards the barrier, it freezes, it creates a ramp, and vehicles going off, and either in this unfortunate event it actually resulted in drowning, but there's been other cases where similar things happen, but they end up on the roof and get crushed instead. So this called us to sort of see that this is probably a more systemic deficiency. Yeah, Ken?
So do you keep a log of those isolated deficiencies to try and determine if that is, more a systemic thing? And I suppose supplementary to that, is that a centralized log or something?
Yeah. Sorry, what was the last question? Centralized?
Oh, is it a centralized database? Like, so different regions are inputting this information to see if we're getting trends.
Yeah, no, good question. Yes, we do. So there would be a monthly meeting between all the regional crash investigations, and there's a national unit and a national manager and national coordinator. So every month there's a follow-up meeting, and every region would talk about their crashes and lift things which they want to discuss. And then on a national level, you would gather that, you will have a discussion. You would sort of ask those questions, particularly what you said, Ken, and the national coordinator would then pull it up if it's a national deviation or something that sort of, and you can then sort of aggregate it and see, is it something that we need to check for, do some analysis on, maybe search for in other regions, or is it something that we can agree that, no, this is probably specific for your region, and it's sort of, you continue with your thing, but we don't need to lift it on a national level. It's also then, all the regions has a documentation system, and it's also linked to a national documentation system. And that's actually part of the quality management system of the organization. So it's put in there in a sense that if it needs to be fixed, otherwise it's just noted in another documentation system. Like you just, as you say, you just note it and you keep track on it. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Now, there was another question that's come in on a very specific barrier question, which I might put a little bit of commentary in the chat, and then, because I want to keep moving on with a bit of this.
Yep. Cool. The other question that we want to understand, of course, is that if we find those deficiencies, are they already known or newly detected? And because that would determine our next action. Maybe we already knew this. We know that we have trees close to the road. We know that people die in lane departure crashes into trees. we know people are on drugs, and that's definitely a systemic deficiency, but there's no new information. And so it determines sort of if you just log it and sort of put more fuel on the fire to say that this continues to be a problem, we need to raise it, we need to reprioritize, etc. But there's no new information. Or if there actually is new information where, like in this case, where it popped up as a maintenance issue or a snow maintenance issue, and we really need to find new ways to deal with it, and it's sort of more of a red flag in a sense, where we need to collaborate with sort of stakeholders, internal stakeholders mostly, to do something about it immediately. Just another example of this deficiency again. A vehicle losing control. You can see the skid marks. It's going up on the ramp created by the snow on the roadside and over the barrier down on the hillside or the slope and almost onto the next road that sort of led under this road which they were traveling on. But it was a rollover and a fatality. So something that just sort of lifted up. So isolated deficiency, systemic deficiency, that's an important thing to take note of. And in the last session, module 4, we're actually going to look a bit more into what would you actually do with those different things. So today is more about identifying them. Next module would be more about, okay, what do you do when you detect them? Then there would be some other high profile system failures maybe, which, sorry, yeah, that was the picture I was after, where it's things unexpected, sort of things that are more unexpected happens that should not happen. And it's maybe a strange way of expressing it, but if we take that barrier impact again, which we saw earlier as the example of intrusion, that was a barrier terminal that we thought was pretty good. And obviously there was a fatality anyway. We had another fatality on the at the bottom of the page where we had installed medium barriers. We have an opening in the barrier where it allowed for a truck to come through, or it could have come through a car as well, but in this case it was a truck, and it sort of snuck through the barrier opening, and there was a head-on crash with an oncoming vehicle. So it was a 5-star road, classified as a 5-star road, a good vehicle, but a fatality still happened. And that's where we should really raise a red flag. So something that we thought was safe is not safe. And that's really, really important, because then we know that if it's a 1-star road, if it's a rural road without side barriers at 100K, it's not really a big surprise that we would have a fatality there. It doesn't really change the way that we look at our system. Although if we have a lot of fatalities on our 5-star roads, then it's a big problem, because we shouldn't have them. That's where we should have the best. So that's where we really need to sort of dig down into it and understand why, because we want to do, we need to straight away correct what we're doing, so that 5-star road is a true 5-star road on the whole route, and actually provides the safety that we count on it to provide. Could also be the vehicle. Can you see what's strange with this picture? Price to the one that see it first and note it in the chat.
Okay, we're looking for something a little bit odd. It's a tricky question you've asked there, Johan.
It is. Maybe we should say a clue that this person died because he was ejected from the vehicle.
Okay. Now I think so.
This car also has a seatbelt reminder.
Yeah. So there's a couple of people who said belt not worn, but I think you want a little bit more than that, don't you?
Yeah, so the belt was not worn. That's absolutely correct. But this car has a seat belt reminder. Pretty efficient one.
Okay, Tyrone's come in with fake clip in.
Yeah, very good. That's the thing. You can see it there.
Okay.
So we would expect, if it's not a very strange situation, if there's a seatbelt reminder in the car, people normally use their seatbelts. We know from research that even up to 80% of people not wearing a seatbelt actually use a seatbelt in a car with an effective seatbelt reminder. So it's quite rare that you would have a seatbelt reminder and not wear your seatbelt. And we can see opportunities, of course, where there's people sort of running off from the police and you not really care about your seatbelt, or there's various other things. But then you start to see this, and this is not a very spectacular crash, but still there was an ejection because not wearing a seatbelt. We could clearly see that the seatbelt hasn't been used because it was rolled up to the B pillar, and the pre-tensioner has it stuck there. But then you see that clip, yes, the fake clip in the put in there to silence the seatbelt reminder. So these are, of course, the things that you want to highlight. Now, these were a few years ago, so this is no new information anymore. But at that time, it was. We started to understand that, okay, we cannot just rely on seatbelt reminders to get everyone belted, because there would be things out there that actually sort of put this out of place, and it create problems. All right, so just keep your eyes open, because these are extra important when we build our strategies on these solutions. If we expect that and we put that into analytics to say that, well, if cars are equipped with seatbelt reminder, we would expect that to be reducing fatalities in a certain amount. We put that in our strategies, we trust on that, and then it's not true. Well, you need to get that feedback pretty quick into your organization. And that's particularly what can come out of crash investigations, where you say that, well, we're rolling out barrier, we're putting seatbelt on people, we're doing this and this and this in our strategies. But hey, there are occasions where it doesn't work, and we need to fix that. And we need to get back on that, because otherwise our strategies are not valid. So that's sort of a very tangible example when crash investigations and safe system crash investigations become an important tool and an important input into our strategies.
So this is another sort of example there where you're looking and discussing this in the monthly or quarterly catch-ups to say, this has occurred. Is it occurring in other? Has anybody else seen this, to understand whether this is an anomaly or just or it is a systemic sort of issue? Yeah, we a bit of slobby, we call it a stinker. It stinks. It shouldn't it shouldn't happen. There's something fishy going on here, and that's the common sort of agenda item on this monthly meeting. That does anyone have a stinker? Because it shouldn't be out there, and you sort of call it out. And as you say, on a more serious note, you sort of call it out, and you look if there's happening again and again. And you definitely would then sort of report it through the organization and make sure that the proper people get knowledge of it and can act on it. So yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. An interesting question is coming from Carly around the fact that we know there's a big spectrum in the vulnerability of our road users. So the question: do you consider vulnerability in this equation? Example, if someone is 90 years old, there might not be a big road vehicle speed deficiencies. It might just be an age vulnerability issue. So yeah. How do you account for that sort of spectrum and those? Yeah. I think it's a good question, because we have actually an example of that later, but it's where you have a road equipment and you expect them to provide security and safety for most people, and they do. And then all of a sudden someone dies that are elderly, that, yeah, they smash into that barrier, and for a normal person it would be totally fine, but they die. And I think the way that we've dealt with it is just first to note it, to say,
And then this is also part of the management by objective overall sort of planning process. So every year you would collect that and say, okay, how has our, it's almost part of the quality management system where we say that, yeah, here's a project that we provide to our customers. Actually, 90% of the cases, it works totally fine. But there's a particular cohort which doesn't benefit from this. And in this case, it would be elderly. And that's not okay. Like if we're serious about zero, we need to adapt our system to provide safety even for those. Maybe the response would be to say, well, we cannot do that at the moment. We can't afford, or we don't have any technical abilities. Okay, it's not fine, but it's, I guess, it accepted. At least it's been considered, it's been thought of, it's known, and it's something to work for in the future. So it's definitely something that's highlighted. It could be one example, which is I think is good, is that 30 has been the norm for a long time in terms of what we signpost in urban areas to protect for vulnerable road users. We know it correlates about 10-20% risk of a fatal crash. Probably that's a bit exaggerated, but it's still a good design principle if you want to protect seriously injured or prevent serious injuries. So 30 is okay. What we've seen now over the last years and 10 years is that even at a lower speed, an elderly pedestrian can get really, really hurt in just, and actually what is clear is that it's not even the speed of the vehicle. It's enough that you just touch that pedestrian, they fall to the ground, they break their hip, and with a broken hip, 50% of they would be dead within a year. That's how serious it is. So we don't want to hit pedestrian at all. It's not acceptable to even touch them. So the new policy now in Sweden would be that you're even with you can have 30 or 20 if you can geofence and you can have a vehicle that can brake and have a good sight distance to actually brake. But if you have a lot of cars around you, you cannot expect that AV system to work properly. If you have a lot of cars around you, if you have a high place value, etc., you would not go above 6 kilometers per hour, because that AV system would not be effective enough to stop if you don't have time to collision when you detect that pedestrian. So that's something that's come out of these investigations, that we have fatality after fatality with low speed impacts, and we need to take that into account. Hence, we sort of change the way that we design those high value places where we expect a lot of pedestrians to walk and elderly pedestrians. So yes, it would be sort of part of the continuous improvements that you want to know.
Good, thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we'll go on maybe 20 more minutes before we take a break and go into the next session. So what we're going to do in those 20 minutes is to just look through a few examples of different things, just to get a feel for what we talked about in terms of injury mechanisms and system deficiencies and local or systemic. But please continue to pop in questions or comments into the chat. This was, I would say, high-profile crash on one of our safest roads. We had on the freeway mid-barrier, wire rope safety barrier, but it was a Lamborghini that traveled between 250 and 300 kilometers per hour, like about 250. Really high speed. They crashed into the barrier, but just before they sort of start to experience a bit of a roll. So they rolled over the what do you call it? The medium strip over the barrier. And the seatbelt were used, but be it a what do you call that? Cabriolet? A cab? Not a cab. Something without a roof.
A convertible.
A convertible, exactly. I should know that. So they got multiple injuries, multiple severe injuries, crushing injuries. So you sort of want to understand that, okay, what were the injury mechanisms, what were the cause of death, and what deficiencies in the system would actually prevent that from happening? Is it local or systemic? It's a bit of a sneaky first example. I mean, the first two are quite simple. The cause of death was pretty much their head got crushed, and that's the injury mechanism and the cause of death. But the reason for that, what deficiencies in the road transport system actually allowed for that to happen? Well, it's a 5-star road. We have the barrier in place. It's a decent car, even though I don't think we've crash tested it. It's not known to be unsafe. But the speed in this crash is just ridiculously high. And I don't want to fall into the trap to just say that if you have a bit of speeding, that's the absolute cause of, or that's the absolute deficiency. But if you're speeding in the way that actually puts everything out of context, and there's no way that the treatments that we have would be able to save this person, we would almost classify this as outside system boundaries. We would say that there's nothing in our toolbox at the moment from an infrastructure perspective that could actually save this person. It's more about the speed, and you can sort of start to talk about, should it actually be allowed to drive that fast? Should there be a limiter in the vehicle? Of course, speed assistance, etc. So in terms of the deficiency, I would more lean towards the possibility of actually driving in 250 kilometers per hour, which we can see in some of those extreme speeds, extremes of violation. Is it local or systemic? Well, it's definitely not just sort of pointed to this location. It's quite systemic, even though, and we will see that in the later sessions where we start to classify this and look at how many of all fatalities actually look like this. Is it 90% of fatalities that people are speeding like crazy? Or is it more that we haven't provided sort of a forgivable environment and people are doing as good as they can? So we'll look at that statistic a bit later. But in this case, we can say, yeah, it happens every now and then. It happens all over the place. It happens with motorcycles, with cars, and it's more of a systemic type of issue that people allow themselves to drive in these ridiculous speeds. Next one. What has allowed for the crash forces to become deadly?
Oh, sorry, just a clarification on the previous one, Johan. Sorry, I was a little slow on that. Was the convertible traveling along the other carriageway and crossed over the grassed median?
Yes.
And you said there was a barrier system in there, or is it and it vaulted it, went under it, unclean?
No, it vaulted it, like it rolled over it. It smashed into it, but started to roll in that crash, and then the barrier wasn't able to stop it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. In this case, we've seen the car before, so it's a fatigue-related crash, lane departure. Again, we should remind ourselves that these are examples from Sweden. We're driving on the right-hand side. Lane departure, and then it's actually a rollover. There's no seatbelt and driver ejection. So we can see some tracks in the roadside area. If you look carefully, you can see they start a bit further down. There's a sharp turn. Maybe I can actually do some annotation here.
Yeah, if you go to the bottom of your screen, and click
here.
Yeah, or click on your PowerPoint, and then you'll see down the bottom some options for some pens pop up.
Oh, okay.
So just do a click on. Oh, you might be using a dual screen.
I am. Okay. Well, I'll have a look at that in the break then. But,
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It looked perfectly fine on my screen, but maybe it didn't in the presentation. Anyway, okay, so a bit further down, you can see some tracks, and sort of got stuck in the mud. It started to roll, and then the driver got ejection. So we've talked about this, driver ejection, crushing injuries. So what were the deficiencies in the system that actually led to that? Well, we can pick a few. and one would be, I guess, obviously the seatbelt. I mean, because had he worn a seatbelt, would he have survived? I would say yes. There's nothing. There's obvious that if we would be stuck in the vehicle, or if he would sort of still be in the vehicle, we cannot 100% say that he would survive, but it's very likely that he would. So seatbelt is obviously one, seatbelt use, but the other deficiency is also maybe when we talk about the road, a lane departure. And this is an interesting one because this is quite a common way of building a slope in or a roadside area in Sweden. So we don't use clear zones in the way that we just have a clear zone, but we would use a slope like this, and we would expect the vehicle to just stop in the slope, in the ditch. And in the absolute majority of cases, that's fine. But in some cases, you actually have those rollovers. Maybe the slope is too soft, or it's not designed properly, or it happens anyway. And if you would have wear a seatbelt, you would have survived. But of course, you can also put the barrier there, and that would be the new standard, the new best practice, to put a barrier there, and that wouldn't happen in the first place. It's definitely a systemic type of error. The fact that we don't have side barriers on our roads is not something that's only on this location. It's something that's definitely is all over the place. Is it newly detected? Is this new knowledge for us? No, it's not. We note it. We put it in the statistics. We talk to our executives about it. Maybe it'll change prioritization, or maybe not. It's not really new information, but it adds to what we already know. Another one. This is loss of control on undivided two-lane road. Loss of control, side impact in a head-on crash with an oncoming passenger car. No speeding in this crash, so speed limit would be around 90 kilometers per hour. And it's a far side crash compared to the driver that's sitting on the left-hand side. But in this case, it was a passenger fatality. So the passenger died. And the injury mechanism were both acceleration and intrusion. So acceleration, but internal acceleration, but also intrusion. So in this crash, a lot of rib fractures and head injuries. So that was just not survivable. But the passenger survived. Oh, sorry, the driver survived. So experiencing the same acceleration level almost, but not the impact, the head impact, and the rib fractures. So what actually caused? What deficiencies do we have in the system that would cause this? Again, it's not really useful to say that then, well, if they wouldn't have been traveling on this road, or if the car was just flying over or something else. We really want to more understand, well, do we have anything in our toolbox that could actually have prevented this? Would this happen if the car was up to standard or best standard? Would it happen if the road was the best it could be? And I guess the answer is no. Like if there was a medium barrier there on those high-speed roads, it wouldn't have happened. This car would smash into the barrier instead. Now, we do have the option, in Sweden at least, to choose when we have a 90K road, should we install a barrier, invest in that road and increase the speed to 100? Or should we reduce the speed to 80 and keep it as an undivided without the mid barrier and 80? And that's an acceptable road design where we have an undivided at speed 80. Now, would this fatality still be able to happen at 80? Yeah, it would. It would. So with this car at 80, you'll probably have reasonably the same outcome as in 90 kilometers per hour. So we would say then that if it if it had been an 80K road, we would have said that, yeah, it's this road is complying with all the standards and guidelines that we have in Sweden at the moment, but it's still a fatality. So we should think about, is that the right choice? Is that what we want to do? Acknowledging that fatalities are still happening, even though the road is built to the standard that we want it to be. The other thing is that this car definitely don't have electronic stability control. It would be quite rare to see a crash like this with a car that has stability control. Even though it can happen, you can have a puncture or you can be hit on the side and you start to rotate. So it can happen, but it's much more rare. So I would definitely add that to the list of deficiencies compared to sort of what it could have been. That this car, if it had electronic stability control, would probably not end up in a crash like this. Is it local or systemic? Well, that's a pretty easy one. We have this happening all over the place, and it's not new knowledge either. This would be the absolute most common scenario on winter roads in Sweden. It's a bit slippery. People sort of start to lose control on a slippery road, experience the side impacts in a head-on crash, and that's a fatality. It's been our most common crash type for a long time. Let's look at another one. This is a pedestrian impact, around 70 kilometers per hour on a rural road. We expect that the car was not speeding, at least not extensively, so no speeding, darkness, and a drunk pedestrian. So the pedestrian is going home from something, obviously been drinking, wanders around on the side of the road, happened to just swerve into the lane a bit, and here comes a car, and the driver didn't see the pedestrian until it was too late. I don't really remember if they had time to smash the brake, but if they did, it was very minor. So pretty much 70 kilometers per hour. So what were the injuries and the cause of death in this case? Well, it was major head trauma and leg amputation. So lost a leg. So would you say that's intrusion? Well, in a sense, even though it might be the most obvious thing, but still you can see the blood on the fender on the car, pretty much ripping off the leg, and that's definitely a fatal injury if you're left bleeding. But also the head impact with the car, and those multiple injuries. So injury mechanisms, we've sort of covered that, and what deficiencies, what allowed for a pedestrian to be hit at 70. Because of course we can delve into what are the exact cause of death for this pedestrian, and that could be interesting if that's your research. But really, we don't need to dig in too much to understand that it's not healthy to be hit at 70. Like, we know if you hit a pedestrian at 70, you're going to die, most likely. So you don't need too much information to understand that this is something that should not be happening in our system. This is not healthy. So, well, was the pedestrian, the fact that you have a drunk pedestrian on the road, is that a deficiency? Not really, from a injury source point of view. Can this happen to a pedestrian that's not drunk? Yes, it can. Is the risk higher for the drunk pedestrian? Yes, it is. So definitely, if we talk about risk minimization and we want to do something to actually reduce the risk, we should sort of try to prevent it. But it's not the alcohol in itself that sort of causes these damages. It's the fact that we hit that pedestrian. And even though the risk is lower if you're not drunk, it can still happen. So we allow for this pedestrian to walk on the side of the road. When they do in the darkness, we know sooner or later someone's going to hit them. And definitely we need to provide separated facilities. If we have a high-speed road, you cannot have vulnerable road users. That's not separated from that environment. Be it separated or be it dedicated, that's another discussion. But to allow pedestrians to be there without sort of separating it is just something that would result in this type of collisions. You can see that we're sort of closing into where we probably want to have a break, but we'll take a few more cases. I imagine that you're equally interested in this as I am. Another example where we have a single vehicle lane departure crash into a tree. So it's a straight road, but it's starting to bend a bit. So to the left, again, right-hand traffic, for those of you that still haven't really got your head around it. I know for me, it's difficult sometimes when I look at different crashes, different part of the world to sort of get my head around it. But then right-hand traffic, lane departure, we don't really know why. We don't know if it's fatigue, distraction, or anything really. We just know that the fact that this person deviated from the lane, departed the lane, didn't do any evasive actions really, and hit that tree head on. Acceleration damages, the car, still pretty good car, still pretty intact, no major intrusion, even though you can see it's a massive impact. There was no major intrusions into the passenger compartment that sort of resulted in fatal injuries. So it's more the acceleration forces using a seatbelt, but still a fatality. Again, what actually caused, what's the injury mechanism? Well, acceleration level. It's just a very sudden stop, 80k environment into a tree. So that's a very tough crash, and that's just the cause of death. Now, the deficiency in this case, if we look at this picture again, what should it look like, or what could it look like? Well, you can remove that tree, of course. You can make that roadside environment more forgivable. Problem is, though, you'll probably just smash into the next tree. So remove that tree and treat that tree as a local risk or a local deficiency. There'll be another local deficiency 5 meters away from that. So, or maybe a systemic then deficiency, because again, this is what we see all over Sweden and all over the world, trees close to the road. But there's a barrier there, and we've put that barrier in place to protect those cars that go around that curve, to not sort of fly over the crest and then fall into those trees. But for some reason, we didn't extend the barrier. And again, that's the deficiency that we would calling out here. So we would just tell the region, you go out and you just fix it. Is this a local deficiency? Yes, it is. It's just a deviation from the standards and the procedures that we do, and it shouldn't look like this. So it was just telling the people, like, tomorrow, do it, and within a few days they should do it. And we would go through that again in the end of the modules, where we'll look a bit more on sort of what's the response to something like this. But in this case, it's just go out and fix it. But of course, you could argue maybe there's more regions that would do like this. Maybe it is a mistake, but it might be a common mistake. Well, again, that's something that needs to be lifted, that on a national level, discussed, and maybe do an inventory. Is this something that we need to check more carefully about? Is this something that should be part of a rating, where we drive through our roads, we look at it, and we note something? Yes, Ken.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like you to comment on. One associated with this particular road environment, and so the questions around the barrier looks like it was terminated due to that access point, so you can't continue it on, or people can't access in there. So I mean, I think there's barrier sort of design. You could restart a barrier and they wouldn't have been able to get to that tree, and the specifics of it. But again, how much that sort of, you know, particular thinking does a crash investigator need to do, or is it just because that gets into sort of project development style stuff, you know, can we close the access? Can we not? Are there other alternatives and that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Some comment on that, and then I'll ask another question.
Yeah, the role of the investigator would just be to lift it, and how we organized it in Sweden, and I guess there's other ways to do it, but the way that it's organized is that apart from that monthly meeting where the crash investigation would have the national forum on the regions, you would have also monthly meetings or every second meeting, depending on how big the region is and how many fatalities you have. But you will go through all the fatalities, and you'll have your maintenance crew, you'll have your licenses and registering people, you have actually have the coroner there to go through the cases with the first two questions. You'll have your traffic engineers, you'll have your program planners, etc. So you'll discuss all that, and it's more for the crash investigator than to pretty much do as I do here. They present the case, they present the deficiencies that they think is reasonable, they present the crash forces and why this person has died, but then there will be a discussion in the group where it's not for the crash investigator then to, as you say, go into program planning and all of that. So it's more a separate process where you would sort of lift this in and agree that is this a local one, is this a systemic one, is this something that someone else need to have a look at over the region. So it would be sort of part of someone else's task that's part of that forum that meets every month.
Okay, thank you. The next one's could be a large question around, you know, is there potential that this was suicide? And I mean, the questions that fall out of that are huge in terms of how do you know that, and also what sort of how does a crash investigator from a road authority or in this holistic safe system consider that type of death on the road network?
Yeah, good question. And it's been an ongoing debate for, I think, at least 10 years in sort of at least the Swedish Transport Administration. In official statistics, at least in Europe, suicides are not included. However, Sweden had made the call to include it. We did not separate it. However, in 2010 or something, there was a quite strict call to harmonize statistics, and we were then sort of pretty much told to exclude it. And what happened then was that on a executive level, our road safety department said that, okay, fine, in official statistics, we're going to do it. So we need more sophisticated methods to actually find out if it was a suicide. But we're not going to revise our targets. We're going to revise our targets in terms of road safety, the actual road safety targets, like the official one, to exclude suicides. But we know that there are things that we can do to prevent suicides. So we're going to have a specific targets on suicides in road environments. So we do have a separate target on suicides because we know that there are things we can do to prevent them. Which leads us to, what does a crash investigator do to actually sort of map that out? And so there's been research going on, and there's a specific group with two people where we have one psychologist and one engineer, and they have actually a PhD in suicide prevention, and they've created a formula or a form for the crash investigators to ask questions, and then there is a rating system. So for between 1 to 4. So, for example, if someone left a note in the car to say, "I'm hereby going to end my life," that's a 1. Okay, we know it's a definite suicide. So, and then you'll have a number 2, which is more okay. They've been talking to their close ones about ending their life. They're on medication, or there's signs of depression, or there's a sort of diagnosed with depression or something like that. So there's circumstances that lead us to believe, plus there's things in the crash that lead us to believe that this could be pattern that leads us to a suicide. So there's no skid marks, there's no seatbelt use, There's a specific aim, like in this case, for example, there's a straight and the end of that curve is a tree, and you could aim for that tree. So those things combined would be a 2. And those 2 would go into the statistics as a suicide. And then there's number 3, which is this case, where there's reason to believe there could be a suicide, but we don't know. And then we don't classify it as a suicide. So we would note that the crash investigator would say there's no brake skid marks, there's no brake marks. It's straight into a tree in a straight. But I don't have any other information. So this could be a fatigue-related crash, or could be something else, and I don't really know. And then it would be classified as a non-suicide. So yeah, there are sort of forms and questions, and then someone else makes a decision how to rate it.
Okay, thank you. And a few sort of extra comments around that. I think you alluded to this one where it could be other circumstances, medical incident or the like, which I imagine you'd get some coronial information associated with that potentially. And I think Andrew's mentioning that as well. There was another question in there around liability. And I mean, that one's a bit tricky from a jurisdictional perspective, but, you know, if we had that speed limit and they are not speeding, loss of control, no alcohol, no drugs, vehicle was fine, but it resulted in death. I mean, does that give the road authority more legal liability?
You know what? I guess it would, but I've never come across it for some reason. At least in Sweden, it's not been a major issue. It's just not been up for a case. It's not been up for a discussion. Like so yes, as you say, everything is. If the driver sort of have done everything they can, but there's still a fatality. I guess the road authority could still say, well, you're driven too fast for the conditions.
That's right.
And yeah, and it's on to you, even though we haven't done our job, the ultimate responsibility is on you, which is totally not in line with Vision Zero principles, but it's in line with legislation.
That's exactly right. The legislation is just set up in that way of control of the vehicle and all of these things that they use. The only one I've ever seen, which thankfully didn't result in a fatality, is where a massive sign fell off our freeway and landed on a car, and we just lucky that didn't kill that one. I think certainly the road authority would have been held to account. Now, Ewan, we've got just over 40 minutes left. Do you want to take a little break now, or do you want to?
I think we'll take one more case, and then we'll go for a break, and we'll reevaluate if we're going to do some more examples, or if we're going to go into the last sessions. So let's just do the last one, because I think it relates a bit to what Carly asked about that age. Is that okay?
Yeah, please. And people are very intrigued by these, and I think learning a lot. So they're good to get some examples in. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay, next one is particularly that where we have an elderly driver. There's a lane departure to the right. It drives into the slope and causes lateral acceleration and 100 kilometers per hour speed limit, but there's an elderly driver, and we can see on the vehicle that the crash is not that severe, but the injury mechanism was still sort of that aorta eruption. So obviously the acceleration was still too high for this with elderly. Now we would look at this road, and normally we would like to have a continuous barriers, of course, also on the side, but sometimes we allowed for for it to be a slope like this, because the experience is that with a slope like that and a ditch, it's quite rare that we have fatalities. So, but of course, we do want to have the barrier there. But still, we think that with most drivers, this would be an acceptable road configuration. But in this case, it wasn't. So with a barrier there, obviously the acceleration levels would be lower probably, and the elderly person would die, but in this case, not. So this is a typical one where you would then sort of highlight that and say, well, it works for most people, but it didn't in this case. And also, it's important then to understand from the coroner that it wasn't, as we talked about before, a natural death, just a heart attack, and there's nothing else. To classify it as a road crash or a road fatality, the fatality needs to be as a result of crash forces or the injury mechanism that we've been talking about. So if it's a heart attack and the car is just sort of slowing down on the side of the road, that's not part of the statistics. It's not part of what we do. So we would then, if we get that information from the coroner that it's a natural death, the investigation would end there, and we would just conclude natural death and we go on to the next case. But in this case, it wasn't. So there will be a few like this, and there would be, I think, the first slide that we had today when we looked at acceleration forces, and there was an intersection crash, and there was a quite small vehicle crashing 90 degrees with a Volvo V90, like a SUV, and that was also an elderly driver that was killed. So 50K environment, side impact, but not really hitting the passenger compartment, but still, because of the car rotating, just that rotating forces sort of caused the person to die. So it's something, if we're serious about zero for everyone, we need to take note of this. A few more examples, maybe. I just have 3 more examples and then we can take a break.
Yeah, well, the questions come in more around the reactive nature of some investment programs waiting for a series of crashes to occur. So on a stretch of road like this, do you just wait till you get 3 or these or 5 of these or X number per kilometers before you deploy a flexible barrier system on that roadside, or how does that work? No, good question. I mean, it shouldn't be like this, but in this case, I think it was an honest belief that this is enough. It's very, very rare that we have fatalities on these roads, and it's just been a good way of building the road if there's challenges with installing the barrier. So there hasn't been any real reasons to not do it until this pops up. So of course it's a bit reactive, but it's reactive in a way that it's new knowledge. It was not something that we knew from before. Had it been a clear zone and it would sort of ended in the tree, that would have been more controversial because we know that's not a good design. But in this case, this is more new knowledge. So yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you need a crash to learn, even though you shouldn't. All right, this is something that we recognize. You definitely shouldn't be surprised by this, but a head-on crash, undivided 2-lane road, 80k an hour, no speeding, seatbelt worn. Passenger car losing control, and you can see that on the skid marks on the right-hand side with the yellow arrow. Oh, sorry, no, this is the other one. I'm getting confused. Sorry, this is a truck that actually has a puncture. And due to the puncture, the truck ends up on the wrong side, head-on crash with the passenger car. So the trucks come from this direction, the yellow arrow, puncture, going on the onto the other side of the road, head-on with a passenger car.
So what's the injury mechanisms and the cause of death? In this case, it's both acceleration and intrusion, but mostly intrusion. So really that car was not able to withstand that crash with that heavy vehicle. That it's pretty much that you're getting so that heavy vehicle intrudes into the passenger compartment, into the actual occupant. There's no speeding and there's seatbelt worn, so you've pretty much done the best that you can from the passenger occupant point of view. In terms of deficiencies, what are the deficiencies here? Well, of course, you can talk about the puncture, you can talk about the vehicle, even though that's a bit of a tricky one and leads down to a different path. It's definitely something as an investigator, I would then look at that and say, well, that wasn't the crash force that killed them, the puncture, but it was definitely a very, very high level of contributing factor, and we can't neglect that. Like we have to note that, and we have to think about if there's ways to prevent the crash in the first place, because it's just so obvious. But having said that, you want to continue, of course, and think about what could actually prevent this collision. Would a median barrier do it? Potentially, not necessarily. I guess it depends on the angle of the impact and what type of barrier system. I'm not in engineering in that sense that I would understand exactly what we would take to stop that heavy vehicle in a quite sharp angle. I guess there are systems that does it, but it's definitely not standard that would provide an undivided 80 road with that barrier in the middle everywhere. So it's a tricky one. This is actually one that we would lift nationally to say that even though we equip our car with electronic stability control, lane keep support systems, if we have barrier systems on our high-speed roads, this car would still be in the residual. This is one that we need to do something else, because it's an 80k road. It's the speed has already been reduced. We accept this cross section and this road to be 80. We think a car to car in the future would actually survive this. But if you have a vehicle failure and a catastrophic failure like a puncture, and someone go off in a steep angle towards the other side of the road, that is an issue. So the deficiencies of it's clear. Someone is going on the wrong side of the road. What do you do about it? More tricky, unless you can prevent the puncture from happening in the first place. So you probably would look towards that, but I'll leave that open for suggestions. Another example where we have two cars head-on, small overlap, 90 kilometers per hour, undivided road. Seatbelt is worn, no speeding, but we only have a fatality in one of the cars. So injury mechanism would be acceleration, but also intrusion. So very, very severe leg injury and pelvis injuries in the silver car. But this one is interesting because in the same crash, you pretty much have the same cars in terms of its Volvo estate cars, but one is older than the other. So with the same acceleration forces, the intrusion becomes much more severe in one of the cars. So you can sort of conclusion from that, well, obviously the car could be better. That's a deficiency. But you also want to look at the road and say, well, this is definitely a road where we either want to reduce the speed limit or we want to put a median barrier there to prevent that head-on crash from happening. Also, the small overlap is a tricky one. It creates targeted intrusions, which are quite difficult to prevent in a good way. A systemic deficiency, again, something that's happened all over the world, really, in terms of head-on crashes with undivided roads. Is it newly detected? No, we know about it. Another case where we see it. Last example, I've kept you long enough before we have a bit of a break. But last example then, just because, again, this is a 5-star road. It's a good road. It's a freeway and it has a continuous barrier system. you have your shoulders where you can stand, etc. But for some reason, this car had stopped in the middle of the road. I don't really remember, it was a queue lined up, but in any way, this car was standing in the right-hand lane, stopped there, and another passenger car comes in 110 kilometers per hour, smashing it from behind. Acceleration forces, the driver died. Had there were no people in the rear of the car. Had there been, there would probably be intrusion injuries on those. But in this case, the driver died because that's a pretty severe impact. I mean, that would be a change of velocity between 50 and 60, 70, depending on the mass difference of the vehicle. This was quite a small car. And that's a pretty hefty crash. So what are the deficiencies in this crash? It's a bit of a tricky one. What's bad with this road? Well, nothing really. We expect this road to be good. We've seen this in some of the 2+1 roads where we have very narrow shoulders and you have a vehicle breakdown and they're forced to be in the actual lane, and that was not a good solution, and we provided much more emergency pockets, and that solved that problem. But in this case, you have the shoulder, you can be there, but there wasn't. So there's not much more you can do on the road. So this is more to say, well, there are no big systemic deficiencies in the road environment. It's sort of a bit of a red flag again. We've done what we can, but it's still happening, and that calls us more to have an external discussion with other stakeholders to say that, well, this is probably where vehicle needs to have a bigger responsibilities in the future to prevent this with AEB for rear end collisions, because it's quite difficult for us to do much about this. So sometimes that discussion leads to sort of a discussion with external stakeholders. All right, I think that was my last example, which before we take a bit of a break and go into the next session. But yeah, any questions or comments that you picked up, Ken?
Yeah, there's a few different things that have that come in, but I'll some good comments from people. But one is a sort of frustration that a lot of people have in the crash investigation space, and looking at the tire puncture one where the vehicle crossed the center line, went into the other lane. You know, so what needs to be done under the safe system approach in this? We can't, you know, afford to be putting barrier systems all the way down all the high-speed roads across the country, and it's not realistic to be expecting that we can lower speed limits to sort of survivable speeds for that kind of incident. So, you know, what can we do, and how do we deal with this? And it's a big question.
Well, I was part of a research project recently, and there's a paper coming out that says what should be the speed limits for the 2030 vehicle. Knowing that there's new vehicles coming out with quite a lot of new technologies, but still, what would the road environment needs to look like, and what should the speed limit be? Knowing that would happen, and what are the residual crashes or sort of the scenarios where we see that we would have still difficulties. And this was actually one of those scenarios where you have, you know, that in the absolute majority of cases, you will be able to have oncoming traffic here, no problem. And in the absolute majority of deviation from normal traffic in terms of a lane departure, that lane keep assist system or the emergency lane keep assist system would actually pull you back to your lane, and also with the truck in terms of if there's no puncture. But if there is but then you'll say, okay, well, what if there is a puncture? What if there is something like this? And there was no good solutions really, except the only one was to accept that, well, what's the impact speed that you can tolerate with a truck? It's around 30. So 30. That's pretty much what you can deal with a heavy truck, because you will become a fly on the windscreen on the truck, and you'll experience a delta V of 60, like 30 to a stop, and then 30 because you're moving back, because you're hit by that truck. And 60 delta V is pretty much where we can take it. So 60 head on would be the similar in a passenger car crash. You would possibly be able to brake before that 20 kilometers per hour each vehicle, and that gives that we can probably have a speed limit of 50. So speed limit of 50 in the future where we have the heavy vehicles. And then, of course, you would argue that that's just not feasible. So you will start then to discuss, okay, would you have systems in place where you say that on major freight routes, you would need to have that medium barrier, and there's no other solution. So would you say that if you have a rural road where you have oncoming trucks every hour, your vehicle would know that and slow down to 50 when that happens, and then speed up again. So you'll have a more dynamic, intelligent system where you adapt the speed, not necessarily only to the speed limit, but also to who are you actually have coming onto you in different scenarios. And I think that's pretty much where we are. There are no better solutions than to adapt the speed if you are to be able to handle with all the catastrophic scenarios that it could be. So yeah, difficult one.
Yeah, it's a complex one, and I could ask sort of more following questions from that, but I think we'd better take our little short stretch break again and get into some final stuff for this module. So let's take another 3-minute break, and you can have a stretch, and yeah, back into it in 3 minutes time. Okay, we better get back into it, Johan. A bit more to cover from you, and then I'll just use a couple of minutes at the end to just show people the assignment in the learning management system. And but back to you.
Very good. So we'll do another 15 minutes or so and leave a few minutes to Ken in the end. And what we want to cover a bit is analyzing crashes in a site inspection. And that's not going to be too mind-boggling for you. I think many of you has probably done it, but we still wanted to just go through and give you a few tips of what to look for. So that's why this module is a bit shorter than the other one, because probably not too many new things for you, but still a good bit of a checklist. And then, of course, as we said, Tana is also going to go into that a bit more in the next module. But if we start with the purpose of a site inspection. Well, first, you want to go to a site inspection and you want to have your own impression of a crash site. You want to understand a bit more yourself. The road leading up to the crash, the surrounding elements in the environment, the vehicle trajectories, impact location, maybe how the sunlight and shadows might have an influence. Things like that are quite difficult to just see on a police sketch or on maps, or just even on Google Maps, because you want to be there at on the same time of the day where the crash happened, or if it was darkness, etc. So it's quite important to be there. Also, how the road equipment or the road furniture or barriers and stuff, how they worked or did not work or have an influence. All of that sort of requires normally a hands-on experience. You probably want to compare those impressions with a police report. Police report is normally good, but it's not designed for our purposes normally. So you still want to understand if there's something in the police report that's missing from your perspective as a safe system crash investigator. Normally the police narrative wouldn't be too detailed on crash forces and how people died, etc. And you want to, of course, understand that and add to that narrative. Document the crash site is quite important. At least where I come from, we have a pretty big database where we upload videos, photos, sketches, everything, so that anyone that wants to can analyze the crashes retrospectively and go back through years and actually have a good look and do research or analytics or follow-up audits or whatever. with the information that's in there, and it's collecting for your investigation, for future, and also for future reference. Sorry, I'm just going to mention this as well. Sometimes we want to discuss the event with other people. When we do our site visits, we always bring rescue operation personnel and police with us because they are interested in hearing what we have to say. We are interested in what they have to say. And that's actually removed the need to be on site. We were in the beginning also sometimes being on call and going on the actual crash site with people still in the vehicle, etc. But we just realized that we don't need this for our purposes, and we're in the way for people that should be there, like the ambulance crew and police, etc. So there's no need for us to be there. We can go there a few days later, but it's very helpful if we get the police and the rescue service to actually follow us and talk us through their operation, and they're normally very keen to do that. So with good stakeholder collaboration, that's a very good source of knowledge and a good thing to do. Step by step, what do we do? Well, the first thing would normally be to just drive through the crash site, investigate and document the lead up to the crash location, maybe a couple of 100 meters ahead of the crash. Take photos, or if you have a dash cam, just video record and take screenshots out of that later. You want to understand and put yourself in the possession of the vehicles involved. If it's a pedestrian, you will of course walk along that route as a pedestrian. Well, is there any contributing factors that you can see leading up to the crash? Signage, road markings, road seals, sight distances, light conditions, barriers, roadside area, all of that. Either you noted it straight away, or you can notice it when you actually look at the video later on. You want to locate and document point of impact, and we're going to go through this a bit more in detail, or the points of impact if it's several. Document vehicles and road users resting position. And I say road users, if they're pedestrian, maybe that you have one point of impact and you have another resting position. Locate and document brake and skid marks, vehicle trajectories. Collect information, of course, and evidence about impact location objects and the road environment. So not only locate them, of course, but also sort of be able to document them so that you later, when you can do your desktop analysis, to understand a bit more. So if we go through these ones, and we start with number 2 there, locate and document the point of impact. What would you look for? Well, you would look for oil, debris, broken glass, marks, scratches in the road environment, collision objects, things you can see on the pictures here. Normally, if there's 2 vehicles colliding with each other, you would have some scratches or some marks in the asphalt. And you would, sort of surprisingly often, there would be something also, even if you just hit a pedestrian, there's a mark from a shoe, there's something that sort of tells you that there's something here. Now, of course, you have to be vigilant and see, because there might be, in an intersection, for example, there might be several collisions, and you want to understand which one is mine. What's the freshest tire mark? What's the broken pieces of glasses? Maybe that's not broken glass from your vehicle. You need to sort of be a bit more careful there. And also note that the point of impact doesn't necessarily need to be the resting position. It could be you smash into a tree at the point of impact, and the car is actually resting there as well. But if you have a head-on with a truck, and you pushed away from the point of impact into another resting position, that's something that needs to be taken into account. Yes, Ken?
A few questions here. So Mark's asking about like a 10-second rule. So going back, is that how far back you go? 10 seconds at the posted speed limit, and calculate where do you stop is really the question.
Yeah, 10 seconds in 80 kilometers per hour would be then 200 meters. Yeah, something like that. like I would probably flick on my camera a bit earlier than that, because I just want to get a feel for it. And so I'll probably do 20 seconds just to get a feel for it. But I mean, it would be the last 10 seconds that would be the really interesting ones and really sort of what you would use later in your investigation. But it doesn't hurt to have a few more seconds as well. So
yeah, is it good practice to go out there? So if you're going out there a day or a couple of days later at the same time of day as the incident occurred, or is?
yeah, I would say it's good practice, but it in my view, it's not absolutely essential. I mean, if you can suspect that shadows, lightning, how the sun is standing, like how maybe there's a school there and the school kids come out at a certain point of the day, or there's a timetable and the train comes at a certain timetable. If you have located in the crash that there's elements in there that is time specific, then of course it's more important than if you have a single vehicle crash in an environment where you don't suspect that to happen, less crucial. So yeah, look for those signs and adapt.
There was one more question around, and you started to answer it around understanding where the crash occurred. And do you talk about it from the where the actual collision with something occurred, or is it the point of loss of control, or is that sort of all the crash scene, or how do you do that?
Yeah, no, we would, good question. We'll come to that when we go through later, but the first thing in my view would be to locate the point of impact and the resting positions, because everything else falls out from that. So you, by understanding where the point of impact is and then following the skid marks back to sort of back in the crash scene, you would then start to understand, okay, it's sort of almost reversing the collision, going backwards and sort of ending the resting position, going from there to the point of impact, going from there to where you start to lose control, going from there to when you might see something that's sort of distracting or things like that. So you'll start in the end state of end of the crash and then move backwards from there.
Yeah, good, thank you. And we've got 11 minutes before the end of this session.
Yeah, very good. As we talked about, you would move on from that and then look at brake marks and brake and skid marks. This indicates like travel and impact speed, loss of control, or lane departure, any driver actions, rollover, impact angles, departure angles. So you get just a better understanding. Sometimes there are no skid marks. That's just bad luck, and that's a conclusion in its own. But if that skid marks, in like in this case, all over the place, you would understand that someone has lost control of their vehicles. And you can understand if the skid mark is 200 meters or 100 meters instead of 5. Someone's been traveling very fast to lose all that speed by braking. So that's another lesson where we would look into crash reconstruction and actually more deeply understand the speeds of the vehicle depending on all those skid marks. But that's another course. But we don't need to know all of that physics to understand a bit of it. So still you can get another knowledge from that. And this is important because it tells us a bit of if we're living up to our promise that the crashes would be survivable, because we want to understand if the barrier didn't perform correctly. Well, how did the vehicle move to make that happen? How fast was it going? In what angle was it going? Was it rolling over or not rolling over before it hit the barrier? In what angle did you hit the tree? Did you actually roll over and hit the tree with the roof first? So all those questions are relevant to understand what the injury mechanism was, what the crash sequence was, to understand is it reasonable that we can do something here to prevent this crash from happening? And if so, what would we do? We're getting towards the end here, but we sort of also want to acknowledge that sometimes it's important to get to inspect the vehicle to get the complete picture. And I understand that's sometimes difficult, and we acknowledge that, and sometimes you don't have it and you just have to do what you can. But in this case, for example, it's the same example that we've seen before. On the right-hand side, there's a lane departure. We can definitely see that the car has departed the lane. But then, let's see if I can use this pen over here. we can see those skid marks becoming more prevalent and really sort of losing control and start. And we can see over here is a resting position. So something happened between that quick turn and the resting position. And there's some marks here, which would definitely indicate a rollover. But it's not until we see the vehicle that we can sort of confirm that, yeah, okay, we understand a bit more what happened here. Maybe you have access to the vehicle, or maybe at least you can get a photo from the police or sometimes media, and you get new information that you didn't get anywhere else. You want to understand a bit more about objects and impact locations and the road environment. So frangible or non-frangible, did they work as intended? If there was a pole, a lightning pole, a barrier, etc. That's normally where I would spend quite a lot of time in the impact location to understand that, because if that's where the fatality happened, if that's where the crash force is actually translated into people and killed them, you want to understand a bit more about that. Now, sometimes it's pretty straightforward, like if someone smashes into a house high speed, you sort of understand pretty quick what happened. If it's a frangible pole and someone died anyway, you definitely want to understand a bit more, and why wasn't it prevented, etc. Also, if it's a multiple impact, maybe it touched something and then smashed into something else. What's the first impact? What's the secondary impact? What impact caused the most damage? And you want to map that out and probably understand a bit more. Also position in relation to the road edge. How far away from the road edge was it? What's the speed, etc., etc. The last thing to note, I guess, is just that there are some things that we can't miss, that we just have to document because it relates specifically to the question that we have about crash forces. But while we're out there, normally we would still take a lot of measurements just for reference. So road type, the width, speed limit, safety treatment, slopes, skewness, like road damages. It might not have a direct correlation with your crash, but it's still interesting to note. So this is something that's developed over time where people sort of want to go back and understand and maybe do research on contributing factors. And even though I didn't note the road width to be something that was significant for the crash, maybe someone else in the next 5 years can do a research study on it and find a correlation between something that I didn't see. So we do a lot of measurements and we document them, even though we don't find them as absolute contributing factors, because it's just, I guess, good to have, and it doesn't take long to do it. In the end, you'd want to have some sort of sketch, apologizing for this being a Swedish one, but I think you get the general idea. When you collected all this, at least you want to have some kind of indication on, okay, what's the road environment? Where did the vehicle stop? From there, what was the impact location traveling? And then sort of back from there, what the sequence and etc. So you would sort of include factors here that are not documented in the police report. Sometimes the police report are excellent. They're really, really good. They have measurements and stuff. Sometimes they're just useless. And I think it's just to make sure that we have a consistent piece of evidence for someone to take this up and understand, okay, this is what happened. This is sort of the road environment. Here are some measurements. Here's a point of impact. Here is the traveling between there and that. And it just gives a more complete narrative. So I guess with that, we have 4 minutes left for you, Kent, to sort of end it. But thanks for listening and bearing with me. And it was a long couple of hours to go through all this, but hopefully you've had sort of an indication of what to look for and then also what to do on the crash site. And we will go from there to see what to actually do with that information.
Well, thank you, Johan. You have covered a huge amount there, and I think people have taken a lot out of that and some great interaction there. And hopefully you're seeing the learning management system on screen now. I'll just take people through what they have to do. You now have the ability to write a little bit of introduction if you want. That was switched off in the background. Apologize for that. This is the resource folder that I was talking about. So in the resource folder here, we've got a abbreviated injury severity fact sheet, a head injury criteria fact sheet, Vision Zero for coroners, link to that. We will continue to add stuff in there. I've taken note on some of the things we said we would add in there. So that's where you'll be able to get some more stuff. The presentation is there. You have a quiz to do. There are 2 documents here that will help you with the quiz. They're not critical, but you click on one of those and you'll see there that you get a little interactive 360. So you could click on a camera there and that will bring up, I've already clicked on it, a point, and you can just move around and have a look at that. You can play it, you can have a look. So you can do that from this, or if you do want to use the goggles, you can put your phone into the goggles and then just move your head around and it will move as though you're out on site. So these are the sites, the 2 sites that are in the quiz. The car is a drive-through, so you could drive through. The cameras are isolated spots, so you'll be able to have a look at those. And then you jump into the quiz, and you might be using these combined, and jump into the quiz, and you can see there is a crash that's happened. That is at a location where you have footage. You have the ability to dive into that site, so you can read that, and you've got some questions. Remember, you have 3 attempts at this. If you've got to get more than 80%, but you've got three goes at it. That pretty much brings us to a point now where I can just check if there's any final questions. But we've done really well for time. Those notes are all in in the learning management system. We'll add some more stuff. Feel free to email any questions or other things while we're out of session. But you have another long session with Tanner, but lots and lots of detailed case studies and information. Thanks for your wonderful attention today. Big session. Thanks, Yuen. Wonderful stuff. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next module.
Thank you all.